It all started with a voice. A voice perfect for radio, rich and deep, talking about the news and events in the little remote town of Night Vale. Twice a month, Cecil Baldwin, reading as his Night Vale counterpart, Cecil Palmer, tells his loyal listeners of all the important happenings in his little town. But Night Vale is no ordinary town. Located somewhere in the middle of the desert, Night Vale is full of otherworldly weirdness, like a small world filled with tiny people located under the bowling alley, a mystical glowing cloud that becomes president of the school board, and the various activities of the city council and the sheriff's secret police. Basically, if ever there was any kind of conspiracy theory, no matter how wild or unbelievable, in Night Vale, it's true. The podcast has been running for over 4 years now, and has become extremely popular, spawning a series of live shows, a novel, and 3 more podcasts telling different stories, all under the umbrella of the production company Night Vale Presents. So today, let's take a look at the stories of Night Vale Presents, what sets them apart from other stories, and how they might be changing the very nature of storytelling. Welcome to Night Vale is the brainchild of Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Craner, 2 writers with an affinity for the weird. Each episode of the podcast features one recurring news story, punctuated with other stories, announcements, and even fictional advertisements from the little town of Night Vale, much as you would expect from a small-town news broadcast. Frequent features of the show include the community calendar, horoscope, traffic, words from various sponsors, and of course, the weather, which is actually a piece of music from a different independent artist each episode. In the early days of the podcast, episodes would stand alone, with whatever issue being resolved by the end of the podcast, very often under the cover of the weather. However, as often happens in long-form storytelling, an overarching story begins to emerge the more you listen, typically ending in some sort of finale on the anniversary of the show. In the beginning, Cecil, the voice of Night Vale, was the only voice you heard, but over time we've heard from a number of other characters as well, many of them voiced by well-known internet personalities like Mara Wilson, Maureen Johnson, and Will Wheaton. What started as an independent writing experiment of sorts has since exploded into a podcast phenomenon. Welcome to Night Vale exists solely on the support of its fan base, accepting no sponsorship so as to maintain the fictional nature of words from our sponsor that they have on the show. So what is it about this show that inspired such fan loyalty? Well, one thing is almost certainly the character of Cecil himself. In addition to having one of those voices that you would be just as happy listening to reading out of the dictionary, the character of Cecil Palmer is a fascinating and quite likable character. Even as he is trying to be an objective journalist throughout this broadcast, it is equally clear that he has a great deal of affection for Night Vale and the people in it. He has thoughts and opinions, which he is not shy about sharing, and though often simple and naive, he is also very sensitive, kind, and fiercely loyal to his hometown. Cecil even has a love interest in the handsome scientist Carlos, voiced by Dylan Marin. Beyond Cecil's personality and voice is the sheer absurdity of the stories. We hear about a number of truly bizarre and frightening happenings in the town of Night Vale, but much of the humor of the podcast comes from the treatment of these events as entirely ordinary, just part of the everyday life of the citizens of Night Vale. On the other hand, ordinary events like street cleaning and the summer reading program are treated with an attitude of fear and panic. Night Vale is, in many ways, a very twisted version of any small American town, and it's quite amusing to be listening to a story and, even in the midst of the bizarreness of hearing about a mayoral campaign between a faceless old woman secretly living in your home and a literal 5-headed dragon, to recognize elements of the story that are very familiar. Episodes will also very often have some sort of moral or inspirational message which sounds nothing like anything meant to be inspiring. Messages like, when life seems dangerous and unmanageable, just remember that it is, and that you can't survive forever. Or, your existence is not impossible, but it's also not very likely. Or, death is only the end if you assume the story is about you. And yet, somehow they do carry a strange kind of comfort with them, as though we all knew the truth behind these statements all along and were just waiting for someone else to acknowledge them, confirming that our morbid thoughts are not at all out of the ordinary. Or maybe I just have a taste for the morbid, I don't know. And of course, the stories themselves are quite compelling in their ridiculousness. The nature of Night Vale is mysterious, and these stories unlock more and more mysteries about this town, allowing new puzzle pieces to fall into place, and also revealing just how big this puzzle really is. And Night Vale is one of those concepts that has an endless supply of creative potential. Night Vale stories are limited only by the imaginations of the authors, which do not seem to be running out of ideas anytime soon. Thanks to Night Vale's popularity and the support of its fanbase, the creators have been able to take a number of shows on tour, a unique experience in and of itself, so I understand, write and publish a Night Vale novel, and create Night Vale Presents, a company that has produced 3 more storytelling podcasts. Alice Isn't Dead, the first of these podcasts, follows a female truck driver as she makes a series of deliveries across the country, searching for her missing wife Alice, who, as the title would suggest, isn't dead. On the way, she has a number of strange encounters, and much like with Welcome to Night Vale, the seemingly separate episodes eventually form an overarching story. The story is told in the same sort of indirect way as Welcome to Night Vale, except that instead of a general radio broadcast, the truck driver is speaking through the truck's radio, describing what is happening to her as it's happening, addressing her wife Alice throughout. So very often we are getting the story as it is actually happening to her, though as the first season came to a close, we heard more and more of her talking about things that had already happened to her, so as to wrap up the various plot elements. This will very often happen at the end of Night Vale story arcs as well, and there will sometimes be an entire episode where nothing really happens other than Cecil telling us the events that already happened, which we assume if they are telling us about it after the fact probably turned out alright. Unlike Night Vale, Alice Isn't Dead isn't whimsically creepy, it's pretty much just creepy. It's a straight-up horror story, with very little comedy, but no less compelling in its way than Night Vale. Within the Wires is an entirely different animal altogether. This podcast is structured as a series of relaxation tapes for a patient at a place referred to only as the Institute. Just as with Night Vale, we are entirely immersed within the world of the story, with an alternate world being created and treated as entirely normal. But the more we listen, the more it becomes clear that there is something more to these tapes than just relaxation. And much of the fun of listening is discovering just what exactly that something is. It becomes clear that the voice on these tapes knows a great deal more about this specific patient than you would expect, and is trying to communicate to her in the guise of a relaxation exercise. How she does this and what we learn about this world and this particular patient is what makes this particular story interesting. By immersing us in the world so fully, we have to figure out much of what's going on for ourselves. We're not told or even really shown what's going on. It's all suggested, hinted at, and we have to speculate for ourselves. And earlier this month, the first episodes of a new storytelling podcast, The Orbiting Human Circus of the Air, were released. This podcast follows a lonely janitor who lives in the Eiffel Tower and who is imagining a radio broadcast of a circus taking place at the top of the tower. But unlike what you might expect from such an imagining, the janitor does not have a major role to play in his own fantasy. Rather, he is still himself, and often an intrusion or irritant to the performers of the circus, making it increasingly difficult to know exactly how much of this story is real and how much of it is inside the janitor's head. Even the narrator of the story admits to being a figment of the janitor's imagination. Though it's still in the early stages, the podcast is proving to be another dive into the human psyche, with the story and character study being provided in an indirect way. In general, it seems that's what these podcasts really do best. Introduce us to a bizarre world from the point of view of a character living in that world. A character that we can still relate to and understand, even as they are showing us the bizarreness of the world they live in. Each episode may not progress the story in a linear fashion, but it digs deeper into the world and the characters, giving us new and deeper perspectives to look at. And these stories require more than just passive listening, but our own imagination and creativity and thoughtfulness to make the story work. They are continuing the tradition of auditory storytelling in a world that values the visual, by presenting more and more compelling and imaginative worlds and asking us, no, begging us, to use our own imaginations to dive into them. So if you've been looking for the sort of stories that you can just lose yourself in, where you can fully immerse yourself and truly become a part of the story and a part of the story's world, the stories of Night Vale Presents are for you, earning a worth multiple listenings on the auditory worth meter. And with that, this is the faceless, nameless voice signing off for now. And as Cecil might say, good night, friends and neighbors. Good night.